Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're looking at how people understand the concept of the economy. Do different people view it in different ways, and why does it matter? Hello, my name is Alan Renwick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We talk endlessly in politics about the economy. Bill Clinton, when running for president in 1992, famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." The state of the economy is said to shape election results, with incumbents doing well if it's up and badly if it's down. The party system is organised around different left-wing and right-wing perspectives on how to run the economy. But what is the economy? Do we all agree on what this idea means? Or do different conceptions of the economy lead to different ideas across society about the policies that should be pursued? Well, questions such as these were cast into sharp light by the vote for Brexit in 2016. Some have said that Remainers voted according to the perceptions of the economy, while Leavers prioritised other non-economic considerations. Another view, however, is that Leavers and Remainers had different understandings of the economy, and that's what drove their decisions. Well, a fascinating new study seeks to work out what's going on. My colleague, Dr Anna Killick, is Research Fellow in a project looking at how people view the economy. Her new book called Rigged: Understanding the Economy in Brexit Britain came out over the summer, and she joins me now. Welcome, Anna, to UCL Uncovering Politics.
Hello.
Can I start by asking you, what got you interested in this question? Why did you think that a study of how people perceive the economy needed to be done?
After I did my undergraduate degree, that was it, in politics, I became a teacher in comprehensive schools, and I taught politics A-level, and I also taught a lot of history GCSE for many years. And I became really interested that I found in the GCSE groups, we'd be looking at something like the causes of the Wall Street crash or the rise of the Nazi Party. And one of the topics would be the economic causes of the rise of the Nazi Party. And the students would say, what do they mean? You know, what are the economic causes? And I started to realise that categorising something as economic or even as social or political doesn't really come very naturally. I thought about this more, and when I went back to university to do a PhD, it seemed important because I think we need to know more about the pictures that go through people's minds as political scientists when they're hearing politicians talk about the economy, which may actually be a little bit different from when they're thinking about the economy in a broader sense, the way sociologists or anthropologists might study it. So I think there's some particular work that we as political scientists have, perhaps neglected a bit and need to do.
So we have, as political scientists, you're suggesting we have a tendency to assume that we know what the economy means and therefore everyone knows what the economy means, and it's all just straightforward. And so I guess we do lots of surveys that ask people about their opinions on the economy and that kind of thing. And you're suggesting that you were beginning to have doubts about whether our interpretation of that kind of work was really as reliable as we often suppose.
Exactly. And it is so important, and it is something that we shouldn't really take for granted.
It's really interesting you talk there. You were a school teacher before you came into academia. So you had a relatively unusual path into academia. And I guess, so many academics go through university and then they get their PhDs and they get their academic jobs. Do you think getting into academia by a different route gives you a different sort of perspective, a wider kind of perspective on some of the issues that we tackle in political science?
I think that there are all sorts of different routes into academia, and obviously, no one route is better than any other. And probably the main thing is that academia has got that kind of diversity, that there might be some people who go straight into academia and then go into a different kind of occupation in their last period of working life, and other people who do it my way round of working outside and then going in. And then some people will stay in it always. I think we all recognise in the modern world that there are different skills and different perspectives, that we need to be flexible, that we need to move in and out of different disciplines and ways of working.
Great. Well, I'm really interested to hear about the research that you've done for this project, because it does draw in a lot of ethnographic methodology, so methodology that perhaps we're a little bit less familiar in political science. So let's explore that methodology just a bit, because I think it's useful for us to understand that before we get into actually what you found about what people think about the economy. So could you just describe for us what you actually did in order to conduct this study?
Well, I had a great supervisor who is a well-known political ethnographer, but usually of prime ministers and ministers, called Professor Rod Rhodes. And
this was for your PhD?
This was for my PhD, and this was where I did this research. And I was in a city on the south coast, and I wanted to talk to a range of people. Identified that there were these two districts in the city, and one of them was an old council estate that was on the hill, and the other one was only about 3/4 of a mile away, but was a very leafy, wealthy owner-occupier conservation area. And I did go to a certain number of community centre, tenants association type meetings. And I did also do quite a lot of hanging around on street corners and in cafes and trying to strike up conversations with people. I say in the book that one of the main times was when they were putting out the bins. But I knew that I would have to do some interviews, because people don't break into conversation about what they think of politicians talking about the economy that often in their normal daily lives. So I also knocked on doors in each of the districts, and people were very kind, usually let me in and let me talk about this, what they initially thought was quite a strange subject. And I kind of just kept going until I had talked to 60 people, and they were from a kind of reasonable range of income, age, got the gender balance, and so on.
So how did you get people to talk? I mean, you rock up at their doors when they're putting their bins out, and you say, "Hey, I'd like to talk about the economy." How do you get them actually to engage?
I think the first thing is sometimes they took pity on me, particularly if it was raining. I think the second thing is that, I mean, people often will say, "Oh, I don't like talking about politics. I hate politics." And sometimes they would say talking about the economy is going to be even worse than talking about politics. But if you say, I'm doing this because ordinary people often don't get their views heard, then that can make a bit of a difference. The other thing that I think is important is that a lot of ethnographers will say to people that they'll give them some money for their time. But I think if you approach people in the right way and you stress that they're not going to feel uncomfortable, they're not going to feel that there's a right answer and a wrong answer, then, I mean, you have to be really persistent. You have to accept a lot of refusals. And that's one of the reasons it takes time. I did this off and on over a 2-year period. And partly that was a good thing to do because I started straight after the Brexit referendum, and I wanted to kind of see whether things changed a bit, but it was also that the sheer amount of time you have to put into putting little flyers through and then knocking again.
And what kind of conversation, once someone has agreed to take part, what kind of conversation do you actually have with them? You know, how long does it last? What do you have a structure that you follow, or do you let it go in the direction that it goes?
My interviews were semi-structured rather than completely unstructured, and they also weren't rigidly structured in the sense of sticking to the same order. So they were kind of in the middle. And I did start off by asking people about their economic life stories, because everybody can say something about what they remember, for example, the jobs that their parents did, the kinds of housing that they lived in as a child, and then going up into adult life. And so it's not asking them a difficult question about something like politics that is going to put them off. So that was the kind of way in. And then there were questions that were more about features of the economy that they would know. And I identified 8 that politicians tend to talk about a lot, such as trade, employment. And then it was only really towards the end that I asked the question, how do you define what the economy is, and try to get it onto the economy or economic as an overall category.
One more question before we talk about what they said in response to that. So you have these really rich discussions with people, and clearly this goes far beyond what we get from a survey, for example, when we just have people's very quick responses to set questions. On the other hand, clearly a lot of people will think, well, you've got conversations with 60 people, whereas a survey would typically have 1,000 people, or some surveys go well beyond that. How can we be confident that there's something meaningful about the broader world that we can get from this kind of material?
I don't think that a sample of 60 people, such as in my study, means that you can confidently say that you can generalize to the population as a whole. However, if you do some ethnographies which don't just focus on a marginalized group, or alternatively the super rich kind of on their own, but attempt to compare the way people from different income levels talk, then you can see if there are very dominant themes in the way people talk. And it might not be dominant themes of one income group. It might be that you keep finding the dominant pattern is according to gender or age or something else. Then I think you can say to other political scientists, look how dominant this is, and is there perhaps a way that we could now build on this or test it in a survey, or if not, at least bear in mind that ethnographers seem to be finding this pattern using the methods they do, and particularly if more than one ethnographer does, then that should build up some greater confidence.
Great. So we've been keeping listeners in suspense about what you actually find through all of this work. So we should get on to the nub of the matter now. What would you say are the key findings from your research that people need to know about?
I think the key finding is that this was it might have been a city on the south coast of England, but it was quite a poor city that had been very industrial with a big port and had got steadily less industrial as time went on. So that the low-income residents that I spoke to not only had low wages and often really poor accommodation with a shortage of council housing, but they had usually been forced into quite dramatic job changes during their lives. So there was one woman, for example, who'd started off as a telephonist, but then whole buildings, as she described it, kept being closed around her as the city deindustrialized and also as technology changed. So she had to go into retail, then she tried to retrain as a hairdresser and so on. And, insecurity and forced adaptation was quite striking compared to the relative comfort and security in the more professional high income area. And what the people on low incomes really seemed to be saying about the economy was that the economy that politicians talk about didn't really connect with their personal experience of low wages, in some cases severe payday loan debt, and also, poor working conditions, increasing 0 hours type contracts and casualization. And they felt that when politicians said, as we came out of the 2008 crisis, GDP is now rising a bit, that they weren't seeing the effects of rising GDP in their incomes. And when politicians said employment levels are higher than they ever have been, they thought, yes, but the employment in one job isn't enough to live on, and so I'm having to work extra hours in a second job. And when the politicians said debts coming down, national debts coming down, they felt that they had paid more of the price for that in the shape of austerity than those on high incomes. And it added up to a kind of dominant sentiment of the economy seems to be about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And they would talk about the system seeming to be rigged. They would say the rich write the rules. So this idea that politicians, mainstream politicians, sometimes trying to get across that the economy is about impersonal forces that they have limited control over, did not resonate with those on the low income district.
Reminds me very much of a comment that Anand Menon, the great Brexit scholar, made during the referendum campaign, when he said that someone said to him at a campaign event that Anand had been talking about the impact of Brexit on GDP, and this person had said, yes, but that's your GDP, that's not my GDP. Does that resonate with what you were finding as well?
When I read that statement by Anand, it really definitely did chime with what I was finding. On the high income district, there was much more of an acceptance that when somebody stands up on the news and shows you a graph with a FTSE going up and down, or an economic expert talks about what is happening with GDP or trade figures, that they're going to, first of all, be more interested in it. Secondly, feel that it does actually connect with their own personal economic lives, because as wealthier people, they are interested in the Bank of England and interest rate and what's happening on the foreign exchanges. And thirdly, that even if they're quite perhaps left of centre and have objections to what the Conservative government are doing at the time, that nevertheless there'll be a greater degree perhaps of willingness to listen to these media commentators and to listen to what the politicians are saying about the economy.
So there's a very clear income divide in terms of how people perceive the economy. Is there also a gender divide or an age divide? Did you see anything like that?
There was a bit of a gender divide in the sense of women tending to talk more about the household and the family, and seeing particularly the high income women would talk more about the national economy being a kind of aggregate of that. However, I was struck how much more significant the income divide was, because you can't get away from how experiences of the economy shape how people see the economy as a phenomenon. And I think that the extreme pressures that a low income woman who's perhaps partly on benefits and has got some payday loan debt is facing, compared to somebody who owns their own house outright and is approaching retirement knowing they're going to have a comfortable pension. I think that the income divide did seem to always be the more significant one to me. I also thought there were going to be more age divides, but apart from some of the younger people I spoke to being a bit still feeling they didn't quite know what the economy was and having less to say perhaps than those who'd been in the workplace for longer, I was also surprised that it seemed to divide more along income than on age in terms of the way they saw things, with a few exceptions.
So interesting. And the Brexit divide, of course. Is it true that Leave voters and Remain voters think differently about the economy?
I think this is a very complicated story, and probably one that it's hard to generalise about. First of all, I did ask people what they thought about two of the key Brexit issues, trade and migration. And this city had had a lot of citizens from other parts of the European Union coming to work there over the previous 10, 15, 20 years. And so when they talked about migration, they did talk about migration from the rest of the European Union rather than from non-European countries. And there was a quite a strong element of how the free movement into the city had driven wages down. And actually, when economists look at wages sector by sector, there is some Bank of England research which shows that perhaps the one sector where there was a slight reduction in wages due to levels of migration was the unskilled sector. But secondly, that it had driven employers to feel confident to offer only 0 hours contracts, more casualised work. And so that's not to say that some of the people who voted leave were only motivated by what they thought the economic effects of free movement were, because they also said a lot about sovereignty, and some of them were, if you like, culturally opposed to that immigration coming in from the European Union. But I still think that even the way they talked about sovereignty, you might say they were wrong to believe what it said on the bus about the 350 million a week, but they did believe that there would be economic benefits in the sense that we would not be paying as much money that then went into the ether above the European Union and was kind of wasted. So I don't think that the Leave voters weren't thinking about the economy at all. And perhaps in the case of the low-income Leave voters and Remain voters that I spoke to, what seemed to tip the balance a bit to whether you voted Remain would be whether you were perhaps more predisposed to listen to the politicians, listen to the economic experts who obviously in a pretty solid block were saying we'll be damaged far more by leaving economically than we will by staying. So, yeah, I think it's complicated.
But you're suggesting so Leave voters and Remain voters both cared about the economy. I'm making a generalization here, which is probably not what you're supposed to do with this kind of work. They saw the economy in different ways. They had different conceptions of what in the economy we need to pay attention to.
Yes. And for example, a lot of the high income people I was talking to have already worked abroad, might go and work abroad, have children who are working abroad. So already thought, even in terms of their own personal economy, in very different ways about membership of the European Union than people who didn't think they were ever going to leave the city and yet felt that free movement would continue and that this would mean that there was ever increasing competition for the kinds of jobs that they would be going to.
And how does this read across to elections? You've mentioned that there are Labour voters as well as Conservative voters among people in the higher income group, and presumably there are Conservative voters as well as Labour voters in the lower income group. So, given that you have such an interesting and sizable difference in perceptions of the economy between these groups, we might think that they would vote differently on that kind of thing as well. But do we see that?
No, in a sense, what I set out to do in this ethnographic study is just to describe how people were talking about the economy when they heard politicians talking about it. And I revealed this divide, which was much more strongly along income lines than I had expected it might be. But it kind of generated its own puzzle, because if I'm trying to say that most of the people in the low income district thought the rich wrote the rules and that the economy was in some way rigged, some of them then went out and voted Conservatives, as they perhaps had all their lives, for policies like cutting taxes, and others went out and then voted for Labour economic policies. That's generating its own puzzle, and I would like to go back and do more ethnographic research, which was into the link between how they're seeing the economy and what policies they actually support, because I couldn't really do that in as much depth in those initial interviews. However, I do think one thing that maybe this research suggests is that people on low incomes seem to be in some way less interested in the economy because of the particular economic conditions of the decade leading up to 2016, 2018, when I was doing the interviews. They didn't feel much interest in whether the debt was being cut because austerity seemed to be affecting them more. And they didn't seem to be feeling that when GDP went up by a couple of points that it was going to benefit them. And they would say, I don't really need to know. I don't really need to pay attention to what they're saying. And I think that if conditions were different, like if, for example, GDP had perhaps been going up at a higher rate and they had been feeling some of the benefits, then obviously they might have started to pay a more positive interest in it. Whereas this we've had a strange period of kind of stagnation from 2008 up until the pandemic, really, where it's not very obvious that what's happening at the national level, how it's affecting people.
You mentioned the pandemic there, and let me ask you one final quick question to bring us right up to date. You did this research at a time dominated by Brexit. Now, of course, we face very different economic conditions. Do you have any sense, any hunch as to how COVID-19 might affect things?
Well, as I was writing this up in 2018, 2019, I was thinking, well, maybe if things got more positive, then people on lower incomes might start to pay more attention to the economy in politics. However, now that unfortunately what we're facing is probably going to be the worst unemployment since Thatcher, or even since the kind of 20th century, you could have a slight re-engagement, I think, of people on low incomes with what politicians are saying about the economy. You know, the situation is going to become so dire and so obvious and so stark that I think that could happen. And at the same time, as many commentators are saying, I did my research in a city on the south coast. The low-income people there already felt impoverished, that they were facing very high house prices, for example. But the fracturing that we might get on a regional basis, where those on low incomes in the north of England, might feel even more devastated by some of the COVID effects. At the same time, not really being able to predict how COVID is going to affect the usually cushioned middle classes, who up until now have sort of had this kind of more positive engagement with discourse about the economy. Yeah, I think on the one hand, people could be more interested, but on the other hand, more divided.
So many more questions for you to explore, Anna. This has been a really, really interesting, thought-provoking conversation. I'm really grateful to you for taking the time. And I hope it's inspired our listeners who want to read your book as well. So that book is Rigged: Understanding the Economy in Brexit Britain by Anna Killick, and it's published by Manchester University Press and available from all good bookshops now. Now, it won't have escaped your attention that next week is election week in the United States, with crucial elections for the president as well as the Senate and the House of Representatives. Voting is on Tuesday, and at least in normal times, we would have the votes in the early hours of Wednesday morning London time. These are, of course, far from normal times in so many ways. So we might have the results, or we might be waiting days, even weeks, for mail-in ballots to be counted and perhaps even for the Supreme Court to rule on the outcome. But whatever may have happened, we'll be here next Thursday to chew over events and consider the implications. The episode next week will be hosted by our head of department, Jennifer Hudson, and include a crack team of election experts, Thomas Gift, Julie Norman, and Colin Provost. It'll be a great discussion. In order not to miss it, let me encourage you to subscribe to UCL Uncovering Politics. You can do so on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you find these podcasts. I'm Alan Renwick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.